We Want to Believe, Section: The Origins of Posadism. Believing themselves righteous fighters of a racial holy war, the Axis powers vowed to fight until total victory or total destruction. The Allies were determined to provide the latter. Entire populations became expendable for the war effort. Hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Croats, Romani, and Muslims were sent to death camps by the Nazis and their allies in the Balkans. Unknown millions of Koreans, Chinese, Indochinese, Filipinos, Malaysians, and others were targeted by the Japanese Imperial Army for mass murder. 3 million Bengalis were starved by the British. And, as Trotsky predicted in 1938, the systematic, quote, physical extermination of the Jews was enacted by the Nazi regime with an industrial revolutionary fervor. Vastly improved explosives and aircraft technology reduced entire cities to smoldering rubble. Rotterdam, Dresden, Warsaw, Tokyo, and dozens of others were almost completely destroyed to break the enemy's will. The USSR got the worst of it, with 27 million dead and 1,700 towns destroyed. Somehow, none of the carnage was enough to be decisive, as if there were higher levels of atrocities yet to be achieved. The cruelty of the combatants only hardened apace with the exponential destructive power of their weaponry, and urgency to win the war pushed to completion projects previously only theoretical, with incredible speed. Germany boasted the most advanced rocketry program, headed by Wernher von Braun, producing the A-4 missile capable of traveling nearly 200 miles across the British Channel, or Eastern Front no man's lands, to detonate in British or Russian cities faster than air raid warnings. It was such a terrifying development that Churchill and Stalin personally resolved to reverse engineer it from the debris. The need to stop aerial assaults produced new anti-aircraft flak defenses, including a jet-propelled aerial mine called the Fireball, that hung in the air and sometimes seems to follow planes, as if piloted by some tiny intelligent creature. Panicked Allied pilots called the unidentified objects, quote, Foo Fighters, referencing a popular comic strip which featured spherical vehicles called Foo-mobiles, a term that would fuel a new generation of extraterrestrial storylines in pulp science fiction. The grand prize, however, would be splitting the atom. Quote, the atom contains within itself a mighty hidden energy, and the greatest task of physics consists in pumping out this energy, pulling out the cork so that this hidden energy may burst forth in a fountain. Trotsky orated to a group of Soviet scientists in 1926. Quote, this is not at all a hopeless task, and what prospects it opens before us. End quote. Others, like H.G. Wells in his 1913 novel The World Set Free, understood that another possible ramification was a new class of weaponry that could destroy cities, countries, or continents in a flash. Promises of a Marshall Trump card motivated the initiation of the Axis Uranprojekt and the Allies' Manhattan Project in 1942. Both sides assembled their greatest minds in physics and engineering, some with the knowledge they were building a doomsday device, some with the hope it would be the weapon to end the war to end all wars. While most Latin American countries joined the war effort on the side of the Allies, with whom they had the strongest economic ties, Argentina stayed neutral in a strategy of both patience and indecision. The Argentine oligarchy was tied to Britain and the United States, but Germanophile elements of the elite and military privately strategized a different course. A central conspirator was Juan Domingo Peron, a young officer from the Ski Corps who spent a 2-year tour of duty with the Italian and German armies. His fascist counterparts warmly showed him the heights of their martial society, from their precise organization of armed forces, to the hypnotic discipline its leaders commanded from the masses. Peron left Europe in 1941, convinced the Axis powers would win, and that Argentina was the logical choice to be their proxy in Latin America. Shortly after his return, Peron and like-minded military officials organized a secret society called the United Officers Group, GOU. They hid their pro-fascist agenda in order to align with other sectors of the army and elite tired of the hesitancy and fraudulent elections of the governing Concordancia alliance. There was little resistance to their 1943 coup, allowing them to replace pro-Ally officials with GOU operatives, including their own Pedro Ramirez as president. Peron received two minor positions, Secretary to the Minister of War and Secretariat of Labor and Social Welfare. In the time it took them to launch their coup, however, the once seemingly unstoppable Axis offensive reached its limit at the Russian city of Stalingrad, named after Stalin's heroic defense of the city from Tsarist forces during the Russian Civil War. After the German 6th Division with heavy Luftwaffe support took half the city, history repeated. The Red Army closed their supply line. Hundreds of thousands of Axis troops were trapped, starving for freezing months as a sacrifice to their mad Führer who refused to admit defeat. The Nazi war effort would never recover from the loss. Allied forces invaded Sicily in July, leading to Italian capitulation in September. Partisan forces kept up the fight against the German occupiers, who replaced the Italians in the Balkans. By the end of the year, the Nazis were in full retreat from Russia. The Red Army began a counteroffensive that arrived in Berlin in the April of 1945, ending the war in Europe. Peron was perhaps quicker than anyone else in the GOU to realize the premise of their coup had been pulled from beneath them. Not only would the Axis lose the war, what little popular support the GOU had earned in removing the previous unpopular regime vanished after they outlawed political parties, censored the press, restored church control over education, and banned left-wing elements of the CGT. In an attempt to earn back some legitimacy, Peron transformed his position as Secretary of Labor from a merely bureaucratic imitation of the U.S.'s Bureau of Labor Statistics to a pro-worker arbiter of labor disputes. He visited picket lines and observed negotiations between union officials and management, usually putting his thumb on the labor side of the scale. He signed major labor agreements and delivered victory speeches in the open-necked, long-sleeve shirt popular amongst the workers, but mocked by the upper classes. Often accompanying him was his wife Eva, a B-list actress known for her love of common Argentinians and disdain for the elite. He decreed extensions on health insurance, retirement benefits, paid vacations, and holidays, and protected workers for organizing, so long as they aligned with Peron. Union leaders thought they found a patsy. Perhaps he was a military functionary so out of touch with the Argentinian bourgeoisie, he had no idea the danger he was putting himself in by granting workers the rights they long demanded. In reality, Peron was taking advantage of them. Quote, "Workers began to trust the Secretary of Labor," wrote historian Robert Jackson Alexander, who studied the Argentinian labor movement during those years. Quote, "Not the union reps." Leftist labor leaders who attempted to keep their unions independent soon found there was no chance of victory without kissing Peron's ring. Cristali's Shoemakers Union, representing the majority of workers in the industry, was one such casualty. By fighting for its independence from the military junta, it lost its right to collectively bargain. The shoemaker rank and file were forced to switch to a new union, set up by his loyalists. Peron's CGT devoured nearly all its rivals in this fashion, and by the fall of 1944, the Golpista was invited to their annual Mayday celebration as a guest of honor. Despite his admiration for Mussolini and affinity with the Argentine proletariat, Peron had little interest in replicating a fascist or socialist model. He instead developed the idea of a strong state that would mediate between capital and labor in the interest of the Argentine nation as a whole. He later called the platform justicialismo, social justice with an extreme workerist and nationalist aesthetic. While most Trotskyists parroted the standard left position that Peron was a fascist, opportunistically feigning affinity with the working class, this emerging, quote, third position was vastly popular with the workers and terrifying to the middle class, oligarchy, and the US and British embassies. Under pressure from the Allies closing in on Berlin and Japan, the GOU finally broke their neutrality and announced new elections in 1945. Knowing Peron would easily win if he ran, the GOU launched a new coup in October to arrest him and remove his allies from power. The Supreme Court immediately reversed his popular decrees. Paid holidays and other benefits disappeared from the calendar. When some workers found their paycheck light, employers told them to go ask Peron for their money. The CGT called a strike for 18th of October, demanding the return of the benefits. Independently, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of workers filled Buenos Aires a day early, chanting for the release and restoration of Peron himself, and attacked his perceived opponents, bosses and leftists alike. Guillermo Almeira, a young socialist fresh out of military school, remembered that day as a major turning point in his own life and the history of the country. Party leaders gave him a .45 revolver and told him to guard their office in the Cerrito neighborhood of central Buenos Aires. He watched the workers swarm past the building in a deranged procession that looked like, quote, a cross between a party and an act of desacralization. He knew they were, quote, wrong, but wondered, quote, what is the rational core of this enormous collective effort? If they attack the center and I shoot into the air, what can I achieve other than, once they recover from the shot, they return to charge and burn the premises with me inside? The threat of proletarian violence was also felt at the highest levels of government. Fearing a full revolution, Peron was freed from captivity and taken to calm the masses gathered at Plaza del Mayo. He saluted the crowd and called off the general strike for the next day. It would instead be a new holiday, he announced, to celebrate the largest worker uprising since the insurrection of 1919, and the first day of his presidential campaign, Loyalty Day. Among the first leftists to issue a nuanced analysis of the Peronist phenomenon was the Grupo Cuarta Internacional, Fourth International Group, GCI. They were a secret cadre of Trotskyist entryists into the Socialist Party, known only by their newspaper, Frente Obrero, and its most prominent byline, the unknown militant J. Posadism. Quote, when they yell Viva Peron, the proletariat expresses their repudiation to the pseudo-workers' parties whose principal forces in the last years have oriented towards pushing the imperialist bloodshed. End quote. An editorial announced after October. In another analysis, they compared Peron to Lázaro Cárdenas, the Mexican president who established single-party rule in Mexico, instituted land reform and modernization efforts, seized industry owned by the United States, and granted Trotsky asylum. Cárdenas's nationalizations were so brazen, many believed he was enacting Trotsky's program. In reality, Trotsky was only critically supportive. He categorized figures like Cárdenas as, quote, Bonapartist, referring to the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte established to complete many of the tasks of the French Revolution, while keeping the lower classes from any real power. In the context of semi-colonial countries like Mexico, where, Trotsky wrote, the government, quote, veers between domestic and foreign capital, between the weak national bourgeoisie and the relatively powerful proletariat. A Bonapartist sui generis leader like Cárdenas was useful in advancing native bourgeois control against imperialist interests, thus putting the working class on a better footing to organize the revolution. The events of 1946 provided ample evidence for the GCI case that Peron was more Napoleon than Mussolini. A, quote, Democratic Union ticket emerged to oppose Peron's candidacy, led by the political parties of the traditional imperial oligarchy, with assistance from the US and British embassies. Still believing Peron to be a fascist, the socialist and communist parties joined the ticket as well. Only the GCI and a handful of other Trotskyists fully endorsed Peron's workerist and anti-imperialist, quote, Labor Party. With electoral lines drawn between bourgeois democratic stability and authoritarian nationalist sovereigntist workerism, Peron won 53% of the vote. Once in power, he applied the same methods by which he had co-opted the workers' movement to every institution. Critical journalists, political parties, and wealthy opposition elements were suppressed or expropriated to the Peronist state. With full command of the economy, he took advantage of a Europe ravaged by war to sell Argentina's vast stores of meat and grain, and fund free education, increase wages and benefits, and invest in industrializing in the Argentine interior. Peron, then, fulfilled the predictions of both the GCI and his liberal critics by becoming the champion of the emerging native industrial bourgeoisie against the dregs of the 19th century agricultural oligarchy, and a dictator beloved by the working class. In 1947, the GCI started a new weekly newspaper aimed at the workers and socialists who recognized that a continued opposition to Peronism meant turning one's back on the masses. Vos Proletaria, Proletarian Voice. Its first editions prominently featured analysis on Peronism from J. Posadism and a dramatic mission statement. Beginning of long quote. A party, said Trotsky, is not only a program, but when this program is carried out in the flesh and blood in the body of the proletariat. This was the root of our militant logic. This is the key idea that mobilizes and guides our energy. To make the program merge simultaneously with the proletariat. Without merging with it, nothing solid and lasting can be built. End quote. Turned into a dissident of the Socialist Party by the events of 17th of October, Guillermo Almeira became a voracious reader of Vos Proletaria, but had no idea who they were and knew no one quite liked them. He finally found a like-minded troublemaker in the stairwell of the Casa del Pueblo Socialist Party headquarters, Adolfo Gilly, a thin and pale bohemian, in thick circular glasses and a bow tie, refusing to leave until the party broke their alliance with the imperialist embassies. The two talked for hours until the building closed and the janitor swept them out as an inseparable two-man cadre. Reveling in heresies against the party, they tore through books of Lenin, Trotsky, and other literature banned from the socialist libraries. Stories of clandestine pre-1917 Bolshevik life inspired them to author their own pseudonymous and threatening polemics against the SP's tepid politics. Soon they put into action a plan to punish its weary bureaucracy. Almeida entered himself into an unopposed party election for a position with the power to expel members in bad standing. Party veterans and elected officials alike fell victim to Almeida's miniature purge. After not too long, they were summoned back to the Casa del Pueblo, labeled Peronist agents, and once again kicked out, this time laughing and singing the Internacional towards Avenida del Mayo to celebrate their expulsion by getting blackout drunk. Once recovered from their bender, they decided it was time to get serious. Vos Proletaria had convinced them to become militants for the Fourth International, but their only contact was with a strongly anti-Peronist Grupo Obrero Marxista, led by a young protege of Liborio Justo, Nahuel Moreno. To the GOM, 17th of October was, quote, a mobilization organized by the police, the military, and nothing more. And the GCI an, quote, ideological agent of Peronism. While Moreno could often be found with his teen friends plotting at the pizzeria or chanting Cuarta, Cuarta, with his small cadre at demonstrations, quote, it's true there are only 4 of you, one onlooker famously quipped. The GCI was underground, and no one had a clue who Posadism even was. The name was as mysterious then as it is now. Could he be some organic intellectual from Posadism, a village in Argentina's distant north once known as an anarchist stronghold, but for little else since? Or could the name refer to one of several Posadist streets, perhaps the one in Buenos Aires, where Juan and Eva Peron once lived? And what did the J stand for? With no solid leads, they joined the small group of another pro-Peronist provocateur, recently expelled from the Socialist Party for stirring up a militant strike among the northern sugar workers of Jujuy, Esteban Rey. After they earned his trust, Rey helped arrange a meeting with the GCI in 1948. Almeira and Gilly were given an address in Maciel Island, an industrial corner of Buenos Aires near the ports. Inside the nondescript building, they found 6 stern men of working-class airs, presumably there to judge their worthiness as militants. They were poached from the Socialist Party and the Cordoban Trotskyist Old Guard, Roberto Muñiz and José Lunganzo, 2 young metallurgists from the Villa Castellino Socialist Youth, textile worker Oscar Fernandez, and 2 intellectuals, Daniel Malach and another Italian-Argentinian autodidact with anarchist origins, named Dante Minazoli. At their center was a man with a completely white crown of hair curled around a bald and, quote, powerful skull. He reminded Almeira of Diego Rivera's depiction of Miguel Hidalgo, the Creole Mexican priest who initiated the rebellion against the country's foreign-born rulers. But while Rivera's Hidalgo appeared calm and thoughtful, this man was clearly buzzing with a youthful vitality matching his, quote, sporty body and vivacious young face, in which small, scrutinizing, and calculating little eyes stood out. We knew from the first moment, without even thinking about it, this was Posadism. End quote. Only a slight resemblance to the young union organizer and athlete once called Homero Cristali remained. The collapse of PORS had meant the end of his meager paycheck from New York around the time of the birth of his second child, Elvira. Initially, he tried out for the soccer club, Independientes, briefly making the backup team before being cut and returning to painting gigs. Stretched thin by his growing family and militant commitments, his hair rapidly fell out, and a chronic bone disease resulting from childhood malnourishment crept back. The problem threatened to become intergenerational, he wrote, as the family's budget dwindled to just 30 cents a day. Quote, I had to choose to make my family go hungry, and I as well, or do these tasks, between studying Marxism and taking Joel, party name of his son Leon, to the hospital to cure his asthma. I chose to study Marxism. End quote. Leon Cristali had a similar memory of this period, remembering his father went out to buy vegetables and returned with paper and ink. Quote, fill the head with the necessary ideas, he told him and his sister, and the stomach will comfort itself and need less in order to produce what is necessary to live. End quote. Posadism saw professional revolutionary militancy as a way to combine his political devotion with an exit from poverty. Quote, all of this was a stage of formation, he later wrote, quote continued, as well as theoretical conviction. I already had it. But it had to be developed on the stage of Argentina and the International. That required a much higher duality than the general theory of Marxism. I had to prepare myself and organize a movement of critical support for Peronism, and to make from that a base for a revolutionary movement. End quote. By all accounts, he was a natural for the task. He was very astute and of quick intelligence, Almeida wrote. He knew the weak and strong points of people, and he seemed politically mature, with an experience and smell of class that I could learn a lot from, which is what he wanted. End quote. The two sheepishly presented themselves, their history with the socialists, their broad agreement with the GCI approach to Peronism, and their belief in the mission of the Fourth International. They then cautiously proceeded to criticize some of what they read in Vos Proletaria. Their main disagreement was the qualification of Argentina as colonial or semi-colonial. They believed it to be dependent on imperialism, but fully capitalist. They braced themselves for Marxist warfare as Posadism began to speak. Suddenly he stopped and confidently raised his butt off the ground and launched a very strong fart, saying to our puzzled faces something like that it was better for us and for him that he not hold it in. End quote. With the tension in the air cut, Posadis's tone shifted to aggressive recruitment. He accepted their critique, quote, practically without discussion, and invited them to join the editorial board of VP. The overeagerness at first concerned them. How could the GCI, which appeared so intransigent in print, so quickly yield to critique? In subsequent meetings they learned the truth. The iron-willed Posadis of Vos Proletaria was actually a democratic centralism personified in a composite pen name, a collective Lenin who decisively announced the conclusions of internal debates. The man who called himself Posadis, Almeira wrote, quote, didn't know much about economics, geography, or world parties, and his shortcomings in the scientific field made him believe anything. End quote. His perceived role as figurehead and leader stemmed from his long experience, intuition used to arbitrate debates, working-class legitimacy, and the charisma needed to win new militants to the organization. Almeira and Gilly accepted the offered positions, and encouraged their few comrades to integrate as well. Esteban Rey joined soon after, bringing with him lawyer comrades Angel Fanjul and Dora Kolodesky, and respected historian of Latin America Alberto J. Pla. They found more working-class recruits in the socialist and communist youth groups, including a dedicated young metallurgist from Rosario, the German Jewish refugee Paul Schultz. Their 2-hour meetings began with a, quote, balance of progress on previously passed resolutions and proposals for next steps. Extra time was spent discussing literature. The most popular books between them, aside from many recently translated texts from the Marxist canon and the International, was literature about the culture and struggle of indigenous people in Latin America, a favorite subject of Pla, and an artifact of the heavy influence of the exiled Bolivian Trotskyists who were a part of the Cordobés group. A text that received broad agreement was assigned to the group's growing working-class base. Required reading included Jorge Isaca's study of the Ecuadorian hacienda system, Huasipungo, and Ciro Alegria's novel about indigenous revolts in Peru, El Mundo es Ancho y Lleno, Broad and Alien is the World. For politics, they read Vos Proletaria and the newspaper of the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, The Militant. From his experience with Mangan, Posadis still believed the SWP were the kingmakers, who could recognize them as the official Argentine section of the International, a central mission of the group, and a necessity for Posadis to feed his family. But the Fourth International was so decimated by the war that many thought it was either mythical or had disappeared entirely. Ex-Posadist Luciano Dondero remembered Posadis telling him he learned English as he searched the paper for clues of its reemergence. Quote, he would then translate into Spanish for his comrades, writing those translations on sheets of paper stolen from the post office. End quote. He made first contact in May of 1946 in a letter professing the group's enthusiasm for The Militant, and asking how to send a donation for the electoral campaign of the reconstituted French section. He also commented on an inter-party debate that had been raging since 1943, in which SWP members Felix Moro and Albert Goldman criticized orthodox conceptions of the majority of the SWP, especially the optimism that U.S. imperialism would break down after the war. It was more likely, they argued, that the Western economy would gradually recover under stable bourgeois democracies. Quote, they are trying to carry the desperate attempt of Yankee imperialism to obstruct and to divert into a jumble of confusion and ideological obfuscation the political and ideological reinforcement and strengthening of our international movement. The letter signed José Posadis said. A subsequent SWP internal report evaluated the group. Beginning of long quote. Grupo Cuarta Internacional, GCI, has about 11 members, mostly of whom are workers. Its main activities are directed toward trade union work. This group is not aware about the internal discussion that is taking place in the ranks of the FI, but they do follow the discussion that is taking place in the ranks of the SWP, and they are in agreement with the majority. Concerning the Trotskyite movement in Argentina, they consider that the movement will have to arise as a result of the political consolidation of one group, on the basis of a correct analysis of the situation. They consider that their group is the one which fulfills this requirements. Posadism is their outstanding leading element. End of quote. Impressive as they may have found Posadism, what mattered more than his politics was if he was the right man to build the Argentine party. With the Second World Congress approaching, they sent Uruguayan Section Secretary Alberto Sendik to Buenos Aires to attempt to unify the GCI and GOM. The meeting only deepened the war of words previously restricted to their respective broadsheets, and Sendik quickly discovered the difference between the leaders had much more to do with personality than with politics. They were, in fact, almost perfect foils. When Moreno joined PORS as a teenager, he had only recently discovered Marxism through a chance interaction with a carpenter at the avant-garde theater he frequented. Posadism became a Marxist through the workers' movement, but had studied its theory comparatively little, and his independent attempts at theorization were often painfully vulgar. Nonetheless, he was well liked by most who met him, while Moreno was considered morose and humorless, his thoughtful compositions offering a self-critical anti-dogmatism that Posadism, who could barely write, polemicized as opportunism. Posadism recalled Moreno's insistence on referring to the Marxist canon to settle their dispute. Quote, "They insulted us. They brought mountains of books of Trotsky, of Marx, of Engels, hoping to crush us. A game of insults followed in which we never gave up the ball." End quote. When Moreno said he had read all 3 volumes of Capital, Posadism replied that he had, quote, "read 6. With no hope of reaching an understanding with Moreno, Posadism focused on Sendik. Bolivian Trotskyist leader Guillermo Lora recalled the Uruguayan as, quote, "affable, with an innocuous and inexpressive face, and a tendency to obese thought that gave an air of a Trotskyist theoretician," end quote. Perhaps identifying with Posadism's similar bluster, or at least charmed by him as so many were, the two became close comrades and friends for years to come. Sendik could not simply choose one over the other, however. His orders were to unify the section. Failing that, he was to invite both of them to the World Congress in Belgium as prospective delegates. Although Sendik gave Moreno the invitation, he never bothered to tell him that the IS had offered a stipend for travel. As the Congress approached, the GOM rank and file pooled their funds and sold handicrafts for Moreno's boat ticket. Nearly penniless, he toasted them goodbye at the dock with a cup of water. The Congress opened with an expansive opening speech by the International's new secretary, Michel Pablo, nom de guerre of Michalis Raptis. He was a Greek-Egyptian exiled from Athens to France before the war, and one of the few Trotskyists to survive the occupation in the underground. His speech was a story of survival, not just his own, but the Fourth International's. He reminded the delegates of Trotsky's last words, the events of the Second World War, and gave an account of how the predicted revolution had been prevented. Capitalism, he argued, should have already collapsed, but had reached an unstable equilibrium as a result of the Marshall Plan and Potsdam Accords. In the colonial world, the imperialist states were leaving administration to the native bourgeoisie in a partial abandonment of the economic dependency model they once used to dominate the world order. The task of the Fourth International was now to develop independent labor parties to empower socialist resolve in the colonial world, while pushing the resurgent left parties in Europe to support them. The speech closed with cheers, applause, and no debate. Max Schachtman of the SWP was stunned. Quote, "As far as can be remembered, this was the first instance in the history of the movement where a Congress failed to devote a single word to a report of its executive committee, and of a report of 10 years at that." End quote. The colonial question flowed directly into Latin America, a subject on which Moreno and Posadis were asked to present together. The result was a passive-aggressive duel of faux cordiality that Almeira compared to, quote, "a couple dancing the tango to the hilarity of the entire Congress." Without attempting to resolve their differences, the IS again resolved that they should unify and publish a journal with a clear political line in harmony with their own, this time on a continental scale. The new sub-secretariat body was to include Posadis, Moreno, Sendik, and representatives from Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. A single delegate would be chosen from among them as a voting member of the International Secretariat. They agreed to the resolution, and organized a date soon after their return for the Foundation Congress of the Latin American Bureau, BLA. The false unity did not last long. By the end of the conference, Moreno discovered that Posadis and Sendik had withheld funds, and the meeting of the BLA was consumed with discussion of the scandal and the need for an IS, quote, "control commission" to determine who was at fault. As for the rest of the International, once Pablo expanded on some of the ideas raised in his opening address, major differences were finally discovered. The most profound was a return to the debates about Stalin, the Soviet Union, the communist parties, and how much sympathy they deserved from Trotskyists. Within the next 3 years, it would rip apart the International, a price worth it for Pablo, who believed that the correct answer was necessary for preparing for the imminent resumption of the hostilities that had paused with 2 radioactive flashes in Japan. Over the next decade, Posadis would adapt this catastrophic prediction as a central theme of his worldview. Another emerged in the winter of 1947, when La Razón published a story about flying saucers, spotted by a U.S. Air Force pilot in Washington. Along with subsequent reports of the military capturing a crashed flying saucer in Roswell, New Mexico, UFO sightings soon spread to Argentina. A, quote, "red disk" was spotted in the sky over Córdoba, and a, quote, "constellation of luminous rings" within storm clouds over Balsarce. At a coffee shop meeting in Buenos Aires, Dante Minazoli, the thick-lensed sci-fi enthusiast from the Pampas, showed the headlines to his comrades. Quote, "To me," he said, "these are spaceships." What did it mean that in the post-war period, an interregnum between nuclear destruction and socialist utopia, that aliens chose to reveal their existence? From a young age, Minazoli had been enamored with science fiction, cosmic philosophy, and the Bolshevik futurists who believed that humans were only one race among many in our galaxy. The destiny of mankind to achieve socialism was linked with an improvement in technological abilities that would allow them to abolish death, travel through space, and open fraternal relations with our galactic neighbors. It became an obscure movement within Marxism, Minazoli acknowledged, but so was Trotskyism, and many of the cosmists were Trotsky's allies who would go on to suffer the same fate under Stalin. Minazoli was not alone in his interest in this and other paranormal subjects. In the coming years, the circle around Posadis would gain a reputation among Trotskyists as, quote, "a group of workers and mystics, with cavernous theories and surprising ingenuity," end quote. But at the time, there was a more important higher power to impress, the International Secretariat of the Fourth International, especially Michel Pablo. Days after their coffee shop meeting, Minazoli recalled, quote, "a comrade came to distribute a circular prohibiting discussion of UFOs." End quote, and end of section.